If you don't want to be educated, please ignore this video. If you don't want to learn and you don't like learning, then please ignore this video. If you do want to be educated and you do want to learn, then please pay attention to the next 15 minutes, because I'm going to explain in the first 5 minutes why we're in such a severe educational crisis. Currently, there's even discussion of the Department of Education in the United States of America being completely eliminated. And whatever you think about that, that clearly signifies a major crisis and disagreement in the United States about the role of the federal education system. And there is a global education crisis in the sense that actually many advanced nations, including nations that are historically famous for their excellent universities and schools, like Germany, are actually seeing a decline, whereas other nations, like China, for example, seem to be doing quite well in their education systems. So Western education systems are still currently statistically ranked among the top education systems, but they're in serious trouble. And so the first 5 minutes of this will explain why there's an education crisis. The next 5 minutes will explain where the educational crisis came from. And the last 5 minutes will explain what we can do about it and what you can do about it personally. So why is there an educational crisis today? Well, first, I'm assuming that you know there is one. The simplest way to understand if there's an educational crisis is ask Google or AI or whatever your favorite AI app is, give me evidence that there's an educational crisis, or show me data for this. And you'll see there's tons of statistics. I would say the single most important statistic is that there's been a steady decrease in the literacy of people in the Western world, particularly in America. So America has not been effectively educating students to be able to read well for decades. And this is in spite of spending more money per student than any other advanced nation. So shockingly, it seems like we don't know how to teach people to read anymore, or people won't learn how to read anymore. And I think it's kind of ridiculous to say that people don't want to learn how to read, because reading is a very powerful skill and no one is happy about not having that skill the way they want. Our society assumes a lot of ability to engage written text. And so if you can't read well, it can be painful or embarrassing. So literacy is very important. And I don't think the problem is students don't want to learn to read. So it looks like somehow, in spite of all the money we spend on education, we don't know how to teach people how to read. Is that a big deal? Yes, it is. One of my business partners is an expert in literacy and education. In the classroom, they have a background teaching in many different contexts. And I also study literacy from the standpoint of the history of philosophy, religion, and educational institutions. And universal literacy is a very new idea. Most societies have not historically taught or intended to teach everyone in their society how to read. And indeed, the normal pattern of every society is to have had an elite class, in the Chinese context, sometimes called the Mandarin class or caste. And in the Western context, the clerical class or the university or scholarly class. And these were people who essentially learned how to use visual symbols to do the accounting, the law, the reckoning for calendars, all the way from ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, ancient Persia. Every society we know throughout world history has had a special group of people who learned how to write, and the rest of the society was not expected to learn how to write. Our educational crisis is very simple. The Western ideal of education, since at least the 20th century, but going back to the 19th and even in many parts of the world, the 16th century, the Western ideal of what an educated human being was a person who could read and write. And let's just start and end with that. And my simple claim is it's evident that we no longer have this ability, and we seem to have lost the ability to teach it. So the educational crisis, very simply, is that we are losing very rapidly the ability to read. Now, why does that matter? Well, because in order to critically evaluate anything in our society, you have to be able to think clearly about it. And the skills that are involved in reading well are a proxy or a stand-in or representative of the skills involved in thinking well. So if you can think very well, it would be extremely easy for you to learn how to read. And if, in a sense, thinking really well is a type of reading. And if you can read really well, then you can learn to think extremely well. So reading is the most generalizable skill. It involves the ability to determine context, significance. It involves the ability to interpret symbols, to understand very complex layers of meaning. And so it's a process. And the fact that literacy is a process is part of why we don't understand how to educate anymore, is we don't know what is the point of being literate when everyone has an iPhone and now everyone will have access to AI. So that why there is an educational crisis is because we don't know how to read in a society that has basically assumed for hundreds of years knowing how to read well is the basic sign of an educated person. So we either need to change our values, and if you change the values and say it's okay to be illiterate, then you could say we don't have an educational crisis. But if you believe it's important to be able to read and you would like to yourself be able to read better and understand things better in any context, whether it's the written or spoken word, then you care about this crisis. So that's the first fact. We have a major educational crisis. The simplest way to understand it is that in the West, broadly speaking, we're not very good at teaching people how to read anymore. And people read less and less, and yet reading is incredibly important, especially for any job that you want to do in many contexts. Not all jobs require reading, but many of them do. So that's why we have an educational crisis. Now, the second part of this is 5 minutes on, where did the educational crisis come from? The educational crisis in literacy comes from the fact that when you disagree about goals, you can't organize means. So that's the very high level way of saying, if you don't have a shared goal, you can't have a shared strategy. If you don't agree on what education is for, you cannot effectively agree on how we ought to educate. And if you don't agree on how we ought to educate, you can't coordinate all of the incredibly complex things, including human beings, resources, careers, textbooks, and everything. You can't coordinate them in order to effectively reach your goals. So an educational system that is divided against itself cannot stand. A famous sage and teacher said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. It's evident in the current fight in the West, in the American context, for example, where I'm based, that the very fact that there's fundamental disagreement about the role of the Department of Education, and disagreement's not bad in itself, but the fact that there's such disagreement that some people want to shut it down and think that will help education, and other people think that's an attack on education itself, shows you we're deeply divided. So the crisis of education, simply put, why we have a crisis is because we can't read very well as a society. We seem to have lost the ability to teach people to read and thus to think critically. And with AI and computing technology and the complexity of things like deep fakes and false media and all of these things, it's even more important to be able to critically discern information. So how did that happen? It happened because our society has evolved to a point where we no longer agree on why we should educate people or what being educated means. So I think that, in fact, there's even many people who don't fully agree that being literate is that important. If you think that's crazy, I would say do some research. Many people don't understand how difficult it is to learn to read a book like the Tao Te Ching, a very simple book in one sense, also an incredibly difficult book. And so you could say, well, how does that work? Well, read the Tao if you haven't, or look at my series on it, or look at some of the great teachers. There's texts that are thousands of years old that have literally changed the world. And if you don't know how to read those texts, you can't access some of the best ideas in the world to understand science, metaphysics, philosophy, spirituality, wealth, how to change your life. Whereas if you can read and access books, you can literally, in a sense, do anything. You can teach yourself anything. So the ability to teach yourself, which is called being an autodidact, it literally just means self-taught. It's a word from Greek, autos, self, and didact is a word that comes from the verb to teach. And so if you're self-taught, you are self-taught typically through reading a lot of books on your own. I did a lot of schooling for my university education, but I was basically and have always been an autodidact. So how did we get to this place? We got to this place because we have come to be so divided as a society that we disagree about what education's for, and therefore we disagree about how to do it. Now, that's the first component. The second component is we have not been honest as a society that we disagree about what education is for, and we have not been honest as a society about how significant it is that we are divided. If you listen to the beginning of Origins, what launched the Becoming Human Project, a 10-hour series of original scholarship and research addressing the most pressing intellectual, cultural, societal, and spiritual questions of our time, then you will see I've always said this is the fundamental work of my life and of the project, which is we don't agree on what it means to become human. So that's the third deepest reason for how we've gotten to this point. We're divided about what education is for, what the goals are, and therefore we can't agree on how to educate effectively, and therefore we don't. And then underlying all of that is we don't agree on what a good human life is, and we don't agree therefore on how you should use the resources of the government or of society in order to bring about a flourishing human being. And so because we're divided about what it means to be human, guess what? We're profoundly divided about how to become human. And so the Becoming Human Project, I come to the third part of this, the last 5 minutes, is about helping people understand how to educate themselves and how to use the resources of their own society, wherever you are, whether it's India, Pakistan, China, Australia, America, whatever part of the world you're in, Europe. Everyone has different educational resources, but we also all share access in many cases to books or to the internet. And the internet's not the same everywhere, of course, as you probably know, but in most forms of the internet, you can access books. So you can also access videos like this. So the reason I'm online, if I explained in the beginning of my Heidegger series, is because to not use the resources of being online today is as if you didn't use the printing press when it came out in the end of the 15th, 16th century. So the internet and the revolution of the internet is really, as I've explained in all of my work, it's as powerful as the revolution of the printing press. And this is part of how I do my work in AI, is I understand how AI works as a technology from the standpoint of literacy. You have to be a computer scientist if you want to be in the details, and there's many specialized forms of AI already. Some people build some forms, some people are building LLMs, other people are building other models, geometric models. There's many different things that require advanced mathematical and computer science training, but underlying all of the issues in artificial intelligence is basically you have to understand what is artificial intelligence a development of, and it's a development of computing technology. And the computing technology is essentially the combination of computational technology with the history of literacy. So particularly with large language models, what you're doing is you're combining what humans know in order to produce a new kind of access to that information or even new forms of knowledge. And whenever society develops a system that can use the prior forms of the society in a new way, like literacy does, when you had a printing press, you could suddenly make books available at a scale that manuscripts, which were very expensive, could never be available in that way. And therefore, it didn't even make sense to teach everyone to read. It was far too expensive. So as any good economist knows, the cost going down means you're going to get a lot more access to a product or a service or a skill. And the skill of literacy has become extremely cheap to access. And yet somehow, with all the money in the world, for example, in the United States, it's very difficult to teach. And I believe this is because we underestimate how important the skill is and how deep it is. So what is the solution to it? First of all, to understand the first two parts of this, to understand that there's a very serious problem, to understand the problem is actually very simple. The problem is that we cannot effectively teach people to read, and therefore we can't effectively teach them to write either. And those basically summarize the fact that we can't effectively teach people how to think critically and to learn on their own. And without those skills, it's very difficult to flourish as a human being, especially in our society of computers, internet, and so-called artificial intelligence, what I call natural intelligence enhancements, the natural extension of human beings' intelligence through computing systems. So we have the capacity to naturally enhance our own intelligence, but in order to do that, we have to already have cultivated our intelligence. So in order to address the crisis of education, we have to address the crisis of becoming and being human. And therefore, we have to recognize the reason we have the crisis, which is that we don't agree on what it means to be human. And we need to start from a place in which you personally can figure out for yourself, here's what I minimally believe it means to be human. If you believe to be human is to be informed, to learn how to admit when you're wrong, to change your views like a scientist does, to actually test whether your views are right, then you can pursue that today in a very powerful way. But you want guidance. Stuff is very complicated. There's all kinds of people claiming that they know what to do. The Becoming Human Project is designed to provide an elite level education. I got my Ph.D. from Yale. I taught there a number of years. I taught there for a year as an instructor of record, which means, a person teaching like a professor, not just assisting. And I know what elite education is like, and all the education I do is the same quality of education I would teach at Yale or anywhere in the world. But I want to bring it to everyone. And so there's many people who want to do that, but the reason we have so many different competing visions, the reason MOOCs and things like this didn't work out is because there's not clarity about what education is specifically at its depth, which is becoming human. And therefore, in order to address the crisis of education, we have to recognize it's a philosophical crisis, and we need profound, serious philosophical answers in order to develop real educational strategies that work at scale. And that's what the Becoming Human Project does. It offers profoundly researched, deeply informed answers to the deepest question of education. What is a human being? And what is the purpose of a human being's life? And the answer is, minimally, the purpose of a human being is to realize their powers to become more human, to become more free. And in order to do that, we have to learn. So part of the purpose of being a human is to learn. And part of how we learn how to be a better human is by learning. And so the Becoming Human Project is a project that promotes philosophy and learning as a way of life. And it gives you the tools to develop a systematic control over your own education so that you can develop systematic agency, so that you can be a free person interacting in this very complicated world with freedom and dignity. That's the mission. So that's the crisis. We have a crisis. We can't read. We don't know how to teach people to read. It's very important to read and to write. How did it happen? We became very divided. And when you don't agree on what your goals are, you can't agree on strategy or how to coordinate resources. What do we do about it? We have to recognize the root of the problem is we don't agree on what it means to be human. And we have to have a very clear vision of what it means to be human in order to address the educational crisis. But we also need the expertise and knowledge about how education works. I'm an expert in the history of higher education, the university, history of philosophy, science, and spirituality. And so I've basically trained myself as a scholar practitioner to address the global problem of education. And my vision of education is education for the entire world. And my vision is education forever. Education, I say, ends when you do. It's a lifelong pursuit of bettering yourself as a human being. That's what the Becoming Human Project is all about. Philosophy is a way of life. The love of wisdom, the love of learning is a way of life. Thanks for joining me today. I'm part of that journey about becoming more human. You can see that I'm Samuel Loncar. You can follow me on social media over here, I guess, on X, Substack. If you'd like to read my writings and support me there, please support me on Patreon. And you can learn more about the project on my website. Please do listen to Origins, listen to the free episodes, buy it, and join the Becoming Human Project. You can, for $10 a month, you can get a membership that can truly change your life, and you'll get access to world-class educational resources by me. And starting next year, and other great teachers will be joining me. So get in early, $10 a month, or just sign up for the newsletter to get the information, and you can access new courses and see what I've got for you. Thank you very much. Have a beautiful and blessed weekend.